All right, we are finally going. Matt, I really appreciate your willingness to get on a phone call tonight or a Skype call tonight. I know it wasn't necessarily the easiest, but glad you did. And talking about vacant property this week, there's a huge response from kind of the audience, the Revitalize or Die audience around this topic. A lot of communities struggle with it. And I thought it would be a great opportunity to talk with an expert in the field. I know from working together in the past that you have extensive experience in working with vacant property, and the part that I really wanted to hit on was the tools. How do communities fight back against this? But let me start with first and asking you to introduce yourself and a bit of your who you are.
Sure. Well, my name is Matthew Yorkovich. I'm an attorney here in Cleveland, Ohio. I've got a boutique law firm that really focuses on neighborhood development, on real estate issues. I've been doing community development law since about 2007, when Cleveland was facing the foreclosure crisis, and I kind of cut my teeth on real estate law, learning how to figure out who owns vacant properties and what do you do with them, and how do you get control of them, and then once you get control of them, how do you redevelop them? And so I've got a law firm of about 7 attorneys and 10 total staff, and I've got a dirty old warehouse downtown here in Cleveland that I've revitalized with my partner, and so we walk the walk and we talk the talk. So I started this in 2007, going after vacant and abandoned properties in the city of Cleveland. And the first part there is trying to figure out who owns these properties. And then as our practice has evolved, we represent a lot of neighborhood development corporations and developers taking properties from vacancy all the way to historic tax credit redevelopment, to taking vacant, abandoned, blighted parcels that have gone through demolition and then putting those through development projects for historic or new market tax credits, new construction, things like that. So but it always comes down to figuring out the ownership of the property and tracking down the owners of the property. I was just talking to some young associates and law clerks at our firm today, and kind of going over the details of the due diligence of figuring out what the details of each property are. So, that's the extent. I mean, that's pretty the brass tacks of kind of what we do here.
Okay. And I should mention, it's an evening meeting and it's a drinking meeting, so don't. So let's probably a good place to start. That is typically something that communities I work with run into. It's like, well, it's hard to even track down who owns this. How do you go about identifying the owner of a particular property?
Yeah, well, the short answer is a wicked Google search. The longer answer is, some of the tricks that I use is I first, the property records a lot of times will identify an entity. Mm-hmm. And entities, if they're sophisticatedly created, kind of hide the ownership. The whole purpose of putting something in an LLC is asset protection. And so, the statutory agent isn't always the owner, and the identified party on the incorporation documents with the Secretary of States aren't always the owner. Sometimes they're an attorney. So you look at some of those things. You try to compare addresses. So you try to figure out if they're common enough to actually put the ownership in the Secretary of State, which in Ohio, is not required. A lot of states isn't required. Especially you have like Nevada companies or some out-of-state companies, it can be a little bit more difficult to track. And so a lot of times you're trying to cross-reference stuff. So here in Cleveland, for instance, if I find an entity and I can't track the ownership based on the Secretary of State information, maybe I look at if there's been any court documents or filings, try to track common attorneys if they've been represented by the same individuals. Attorneys are great because you can always find an attorney because, for instance, here in Ohio, they're all registered with the Supreme Court and their contact information is updated. And so a lot of times if you can you can track them down to an attorney who has represented the company, simply reaching out to that attorney and saying, hey, I've got a client that has an interest in acquiring this property. Can you at least pass on my contact information or maybe some vague offer or expression of interest? The attorneys are really great about, answering phone calls, returning phone calls, answering emails. They don't give you any information. They keep their confidentiality, but they're definitely willing to pass on the contact or the interest. And usually that's because that might mean legal work for them. If someone is going to buy a property from somebody or is interested in the property from somebody, then that might drum up some legal work. So it's a great way. If you can track an attorney that's associated with a company, that's one good way to track a company down.
Excellent. The issue that I often hear, and I'd be interested in your take, that you kind of run up against, is like, oh, well, property rights, you can't, and everybody gets so sort of scared and to do anything. They're the deadbeat property owner, even if they speak up, but more often than not, I think it's kind of hearsay, like, oh, we can't do anything, it's private property. What do you say to that?
Yeah, well, I've written papers on it. So I think the rule goes that your property rights, your private property rights, extend as far as my rights. And it's like your right to extend your fist goes as far as my nose, but as soon as it hits my nose, your rights to extend your fist are over. And so while, the Ohio Constitution strongly protects individual property rights, those rights are still subject to the police power of the state or the municipality and the rights of others. So, taxing, enforcement, and collection of taxes, you have private property rights, but you still have to pay your taxes. And a lot of, vacant and abandoned property, the first thing that happens is a tax delinquency. So yes, you have rights to own your property and you have rights to do what you want with your property. But if you're not paying your taxes, then I can infringe upon those property rights. And code enforcement is another great tool because, yes, you have rights to own your property, but you don't have rights to own your property in a manner that's in violation of the municipal code, a property that's in disrepair or things like that. So, I know in Southern Ohio there's been, some cases out there that have started to assert a more conservative viewpoint of property rights, and then started to claw back some of the tools like rental registration or vacant property registration and things like that. But it's always been my position that you only have property rights if you're a responsible property owner. But the minute that you're not a responsible property owner, your rights can be infringed. And the case law is pretty supportive of that. You don't have a right to keep a property in a nuisance condition or in violation of code. And sometimes it's just finding, what the issues are. It's not a problem to own a property that's vacant per se, but if it's vacant and you're not maintaining it and you're not paying your taxes, then that's an issue. So that's sometimes a leverage point to get a property owner to be responsible is asserting some of those police power efforts, so municipal code and taxing authority.
Good. I think that is such a critical point that is so overlooked. It's it's always, well, we can't do anything, it's private property, and it's like, well, why is everybody so busy defending the building that's falling into the street? Well, what about the building adjacent that's beautifully restored? And nobody ever thinks about that. It's like the building that's beautifully restored, that's the one that's having the property rights affected. Why are, we shouldn't be so concerned with the one that's not in repair. And it's a funny thing. And there's such a different sort of line of thinking when it comes to residential. It's like, oh, of course, if the house next to me is falling apart, we say something. But it's a weird thing when it comes to commercial.
Yeah, it's a shame when communities let people kind of what's called mothball properties, where they're not doing anything with it. They're just sitting on it in the hopes that someday it's going to be worth, $1 million, and then maybe I'll do something with it. But in the meantime, I'm not going to do anything with it. And And that's fine if you're maintaining your property. You know, if it's a residential property or even a vacant lot, and you're cutting the grass and paying the taxes, then there's not much that someone can say about it. But if you're not cutting the grass and the municipality's having to cut your grass and you're not paying your taxes, then I think communities do have a voice. And if it's a commercial property that, you know, it's not being maintained and it's falling into disrepair, then communities do have an opportunity to assert some of their influence there. And sometimes, you know, even if it's not a property that's falling into disrepair, but it's not being its highest and best use, that property owner isn't in the business of holding a property and not making any money off of it, right? So a property that's sitting vacant isn't making them any money, you know, and so sometimes if you can give them an opportunity to turn that into a positive asset by offering them, hey, you're not making any money on this, you're probably taking your losses and your depreciation, and I've got someone that wants to turn it into something viable, you know, they might be open to that opportunity. A lot of times we call it like dead hand control, that these are like old family properties that someone inherited. They don't really care about because they don't have any use for it. They don't have the money to fix it up. They don't have any of the creativity to fix it up. Right. They don't have a proposed use for it. And so they just kind of sit on it until something comes along. And if you don't even explore those opportunities, how would you know? I mean, so even reaching out to these people and saying, you know, a lot of times I start with a letter that just says, hey, what are your plans for this property? What are your goals for this property? What are you looking to do with it? A lot of times they respond and say, I don't have any plans. I got stuck with this property. I inherited it. I don't want anything to do with it. I'd love to get rid of it. So sometimes just figuring out who owns it and trying to make contact with them is a great way to start.
What was a big sort of epiphany for me to realize, you know, it was my assumption for a long time, is I assume it's most people that's like, well, you know, if there's a vacant property, there's just somebody on the other end waiting to lease it or sell it. And like, actually, that's rarely the case. Typically, it's you know, they're hard to track down. They don't want to be reached. And if you can't, you know, then they don't return calls. I mean, they're not that interested. I've found more often than not, they're not that interested. So all your business recruitment efforts in the world might not have an impact. And so it's like, we focus really heavy on incentives. Well, how can we get these property owners to play ball, to do something? It's like, well, they're actually not sort of rational characters in the marketplace. They're almost not profit motivated. And that's why I think that like having tools, having sort of the punitive measures is critical to working with some of these people that just aren't, they're not acting rational.
Yeah, sometimes they have to be motivated, and especially if it's a property that, you know, that they inherited, or that it's an old family property. You know, sometimes giving them an exit strategy that they haven't considered themselves is just enough motivation. You know, so if, for instance, there starts to be municipal code enforcement against the property, and they have to start, you know, putting money into the property, money that they don't have, money that they don't desire to put into that property, then they become a little bit more motivated to look for an exit strategy. They become a little bit more motivated of a seller. You know, if they risk losing the property because they're not paying the taxes on it, they become a little bit more motivated of a seller because, you know, they're gonna get nothing out of the property. So yeah, sometimes you have to shake them a little bit and get their attention. And there was a former employee of mine sent an article out of Colorado the other day, and it was about the use of municipal code enforcement to spur investment in real estate. And, you know, there's something to that. I mean, I don't see municipal code enforcement always as an acquisition strategy, but it at least brings people to the table. So, you know, when we file legal actions against properties that are civil, or when we encourage criminal action against properties for code enforcement purposes, sometimes the whole purpose of that is just to bring a party to the table, to be able to sit down and have a discussion. And so, you know, you could make 100 phone calls and maybe it doesn't do that. But if they get served with court papers and they have to show up, or, you they start to get formal, notices from the court, it sometimes gets their attention, and at least it brings them to the table. And then, especially if it's a legal action, if that encourages them to engage an attorney to defend their rights, well, that's great, because then with an attorney, you typically have a reasonable party at the other side
Right.
that can manage their clients sometimes and say, well, look, what are you doing with this property? If you're not going to do anything with it, let's find a beneficial use for it. Let's dispose of it. Let's cut it loose. Let's let it not be a liability anymore.
It's one of those funny places where I think that there's kind of assumptions lead us down the wrong path and get us in trouble. So it's, I hear a lot of mayors or city managers say this, or council people. It's like, well, we don't want a bunch of regulations. We want to, we're trying to encourage investment. It's like, funny enough, a lack of regulations really discourage investment. You're kind of working against yourself, because a serious investor is looking for structure. They're looking for, mitigated risk. Money's not flooding to these districts with no regulation. Money's actually pouring into these districts with the most regulation. So there's kind of this sort of backwards idea that, regulation and enforcement are going to scare people away, and it's not the case at all.
Yeah, well, we've noticed an interesting trend here in Cleveland. And Cleveland has had an incredible run at development and revitalization. And an interesting anecdote is the areas where the municipality or the neighborhood goes in and puts like a streetscape program in, right, where they go down and they revitalize the downtown district and put new curbs and new flower boxes and new sidewalks, or really make improvements to the street. We see tons of investment flood into those areas, and the way that we see it is that investors are looking at it and saying, I want to put my money where other people are putting their money. And I want to, if I want to invest where Bill Gates is investing, or I want to invest where Warren Buffett is investing, you don't want to invest where all those people aren't investing.
Right.
So if you see a downtown area that shows signs of disinvestment, the only people that are seeing that as an opportunity are bottom feeders, right? People that aren't looking to make an investment, but are looking to pick up a property for $10,000 or $15,000, do nothing with it, and then hope that other people start investing so that their property becomes more valuable.
Right.
But
right.
we see what we've seen in very rough areas or neighborhoods in Cleveland that had historic infrastructure is that when you see one or two individuals as first movers and catalysts in a neighborhood, that spurs other investments. So when someone takes over an old abandoned building and turns it into a shuffleboard court or a new bar or restaurant, then it spurs other people to say, hey, well, now there are some opportunities here. The building next door is distressed and at a reasonable rate, and I have an idea I could do something there. So it's investment follows investment. And so when you see people starting to make those, not just the acquisition of those properties, but the acquisition and redevelopment of those properties, the properties all around them then become a little bit more attractive.
Right. You should cater to serious investors and not people looking for storage.
Yeah.
So I think kind of the probably the biggest question that most people would probably like to understand are, what are the best tools if they have, if they're a Main Street manager or a city manager, and there's a couple properties that are just, the white elephants that are really just nothing's getting done. What are the best tools that they have available to get those properties, to try to get them under control?
Well, I would say the first thing that anybody that deals with this should be looking at is an inventory. That they should inventory their downtown district or their neighborhood of focus, and they should understand who owns all the properties, who owns what properties, and try to make contact with all those individuals. Get viable contact information for all of those individuals, because then, with an inventory, if people approach you with ideas or opportunities, then you can kind of start to target, well, there are properties that meet your needs or things like that. So the first thing is kind of an asset portfolio inventory. And then trying to identify, the contact information for all those people and making a connection to all those people. So I think that's a really good tool is the data, getting a data point for all the real estate and understanding that. The second tool I would say, beyond just reaching out and figuring out what everybody's goals or interests are with their property, is holding property owners accountable. That, if a property owner has a broken window, calling them and saying, hey, you have a broken window. If you have a municipal code enforcement, you should be holding people accountable for the conditions of their properties. Now, it doesn't mean that, you're, putting heavy fines on people or any of those kind of things, but sometimes just sending them a notice that their property is not up to par and up to the expectations of the community, at least starts a dialogue and brings them to the table. And then if you find that they're, a property owner that has good intentions, but is maybe disconnected, right? So they inherited the property, they haven't really paid much attention to it, but they didn't know that it had a broken window, and they come and fix that broken window, and they address the issues that you've identified. Well, great. Now you've got an engaged property owner that when you have issues you can contact and is responsive to those issues. If in the alternative, you bang your head up against a brick wall and they're not responding to you and they don't care, and then criminal enforcement, I think, is a necessary part of that, holding people accountable, kind of under a broken windows theory, that you got to hold kind of everybody accountable, otherwise everything becomes anarchy. And so, code enforcement becomes a necessary part of that. Another thing is tax enforcement. So, we have a real estate tax scheme here in Ohio in particular that holds people accountable for paying real estate taxes. And what we've found historically is that some rural communities or just a lot of communities don't enforce their tax delinquencies. So they have properties that have very distressed and delinquent property taxes, and they just don't enforce it. They have small legal departments. They have prosecutors that are unfamiliar with tax enforcement. They're not willing to bring in outside counsel for enforcing the tax delinquencies, and so they're essentially only enforcing the taxes against the people that are willing to pay, which is inherently inequitable, for those people that are willing to pay, because, as they receive less tax revenue, they increase the tax rates, and so then those people that are willing to pay end up paying more. And so I think if people aren't even doing the basics of paying their taxes on their property, then, the counties have a duty to take those properties from those people, to foreclose on those properties, to enforce, the delinquent taxes against those properties. The municipalities or the communities that in Ohio have established land banks have created a very valuable tool for a quick adjudication of delinquent tax properties, to get them at least into holding company or a portfolio that then can push those properties to responsible property owners that can, encourage responsible real estate development. Even if a land bank acquires a delinquent forfeited tax property and then donates it to a nonprofit or an organization that has a goal with the property, that has a desire to improve the property, that has a desire to, make it a beneficial property and pay the taxes moving forward, then that's a positive for the community versus this property just sitting, tax delinquent, becoming a burden on all of the other taxpayers. So, municipal enforcement, tax enforcement, the creation of, county land banks, because you can then, across a county basis, have a little bit more sophistication where maybe, municipalities or townships that make up that county don't have the individual sophistication themselves. When you can consolidate those resources at a county level, you can be a little bit more sophisticated and aggressive. Here in Ohio, we still use the public nuisance actions.
Mm-hmm.
It's a private civil action to enforce code and environmental and housing regulations against property owners. Believe it or not, we still do a decent amount of these actions. The majority of them, it really just, the purpose is to get people to the table. Some of them, we've gone after slum landlords that own bulk properties. And so we're addressing property owners that have, 15 properties that are condemned in just in a nasty state. We do that both to protect the tenants, but, to protect the neighborhoods and the surrounding properties. And then it turns those properties back into beneficial use. Here, we have a lot of local neighborhood development corporations that are, I would call foot soldiers that take on, the research and the data and incorporate these strategies. But I think any municipality or any township, with one or two dedicated staff, they're not dealing with maybe the same volume of properties. Right. So with a little bit of sophistication, they can start moving those properties in the right direction.
Fantastic. Well, excellent. That is, really, really good information. Again, it's I think probably the biggest area where most communities struggle, and I'm of the belief that revitalization starts and ends with real estate. That it is such, if you don't have control of these properties, you're never going to have a thriving district because it's dependent on owning a building is the same as owning a small business. But there's so many resources for small businesses and not much for the buildings. But, if a building is available at the fair market price, like somebody local will eventually buy it. But nobody can ever make a profit on a building that's not at a fair price, and so, I'm the biggest believer that sort of these vacant and dilapidated properties are absolutely crucial to get control of and get to local hands, and that's when the real sort of the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, and one of the things that some of the Cleveland neighborhoods have really done a good job of, not all the time, but is being the repository, if you will, for some of these vacant and abandoned properties. They don't always have a plan for them. They don't always have the financial ability to, put millions of dollars into them right away. But if they can obtain control of them, then when those opportunities arise, they can act on those. And so, sometimes that means, getting in contact with an abandoned or vacant property owner and making him an offer, and if you can get a property, let's say reasonable, you don't want to overpay for those properties, but taking a risk at $50,000 or $100,000, it's very cheap to own vacant, dilapidated properties. Mm-hmm. It's expensive to fix them up, right. And so if you can get control of these properties and manage the holding costs, for a reasonable period of time, then when the opportunities come in, you can take advantage of those, and then you can be in control. Instead of allowing the market to dictate where maybe a vacant property goes at a distressed price, at a share sale, or things like that. Maybe it goes for $15,000 or $20,000, and it's bought by a speculative investor that has no intention of fixing it up. Well, then what's going to happen is that, they bought it for $15,000, and they're going to wait until someone offers, they're going to list it right away for $60,000, and just try to capitalize on that. And then the person that buys it for $60,000, well, they probably should have bought it for $15,000, and they've lost out on $45,000 that they could have made improvements in. Whereas if the local group, takes control of those properties that other speculators or not beneficial owners are taking control of, and you can kind of drive those decisions, and you can make sure that, you know, if someone is buying a property, that they're buying it and their money is going towards fixing up the property, not enriching a speculator or someone that, you know, probably doesn't deserve to make a $50,000 or $100,000 profit for not paying the taxes and for, you know, keeping a building mothballed for any period of time. So I always encourage the groups to take a little bit of risk on, you know, to find a property. And, you know, if it's, you know, we've in Cleveland, it doesn't happen anymore, but in very successful neighborhoods, you know, we had opportunities to acquire properties for $1, you know, and, you know, very large, you know, historic or industrial buildings. And, you know, and the risk is not so much in owning it, you know, in the holding of it, because, you know, these properties aren't high value on the tax rolls, so they're not generating a lot of taxes every year. And all you really have to do is make sure it's secure. But I've seen both. I've seen organizations that have been willing to take that risk and acquire these properties from, you know, old family trusts that were just looking to get rid of it or looking to donate it to a nonprofit. And, you know, it might take a year or two, but having control of that property allows you to control the redevelopment. And then I've seen other people that haven't been willing to take that risk. Someone else comes in, you know, acquires it at a you know, very low price, and then just flips it, just waits for someone else, and then someone else. And the property could change hands 2 or 3 times. You know, yes, it's sold for more money each time, but each time it's just a profiteer. It's no one with the positive intentions of rehabbing the building, putting it back into beneficial use, you know, starting a business there, those kind of things. So I'd say, you know, it's important for communities to be aggressive in trying to control the properties, because then they have a voice, you know, and then it's not, oh, well, someone else has a property right, they can do whatever they want with it. If you own it and control it, then you could give it away if someone was willing to make a substantial impact. You know?
Well, I've used up plenty of your time, probably a half hour on the call and probably another half hour trying to get onto the call. But I believe that your firm, people can hire you guys, correct?
Yeah. I mean, I get a lot of calls from people that had bought properties at share sale, that didn't use an attorney, that had toxic title issues. And, you know, I address those issues almost as a favor to the network. But yeah, we definitely work with a lot of municipalities. We work with a lot of neighborhoods. We've created a lot of nonprofit development corporations in the suburbs of Cuyahoga County that, you know, they saw the work we were doing with the City of Cleveland neighborhoods, and then they said, boy, we want to start our own neighborhood development corporation, you know, a nonprofit spinoff of the municipal government that can be a little bit more flexible, that if the municipal government funds them, you know, at least some startup funds or things like that, that it's not as bureaucratic in the administration. So we've done a lot of that. We've done a lot of business improvement districts and special improvement districts, and forming those for downtown districts. And then, you know, our goal is always to work with, you know, developers that are, you know, putting projects together. And so we do a lot of the high volume, low value, goodwill type stuff that eventually leads to working with developers that are building townhomes. You know, sometimes it starts 4 years before that, where we're helping them acquire vacant property, and then it takes a few years, and then we're working on, you know, townhome developments for them. So we're always open to educating or supporting, you know, communities in just kind of these tools and things like that, which, you know, maybe isn't something everybody has money to pay lawyers to do. But the goal is that, you know, by supporting those communities and educating them, providing them the tools, that then there does become viable legal work down the road. You know, when you get control of a historic building, 2 or 3 years later, you put a historic tax credit project together and use sophisticated financing, and then those are projects that they're capable of paying legal fees on, and that's kind of been our business model is making sure we're providing the resources on the front end, and then hoping that karma or the relationship ends up providing legal work on the back end. And it's been a successful model so far.
Well, excellent. Well, I can't tell you how much I appreciate the time, Matt. I'll make sure to include your contact information, the firm's contact information in the notes. And I really appreciate your time and sharing with us some of your knowledge.
Great. Well, you'll get me to visit Pittsburgh sometime soon. So,
yeah, get down here, man. We'll go out and have a bourbon or two and show you around town.
Perfect. Sounds good.
All right. Thanks again, Matt. I really appreciate it, and I'll talk to you soon.